Before I get into that, let me just illustrate what's my big challenge at the moment. So I joined my current company a couple of months ago, and I'm looking after our health and care portfolio. So we've got around 30 products in a portfolio, and that effectively span over what we would call care continuum, right? So care continuum, on one side, think about keeping somebody healthy. So you'll have Joe Wicks and his team from the Body Coach, keeping you healthy, right? If you kind of start moving to the right, you start going to the doctor for things. Going further right, you end up care, being looked after somebody at home. You move to care home, you move to hospital. So kind of the further you go to the right, you are kind of not, it's not very pleasant for you as the service user, and equally the costs of looking after you are going really up. So our mission is to keep everybody as far as left as possible for as long as possible, right? But when you end up in a portfolio that's been largely acquired, right, with the products that don't talk to each other, and they're kind of spread across, how do you come up with a meaningful strategy, right? How do you pull all of that together? How do you make sure that 1 and 1 is 3, right, and not just 2? So these are kind of challenges that are faced today, and this kind of approach really helped me to deal with. We had a really interesting conversation at one of the tables over there, which I thought was such a perfect starter, the need for feedback, giving customers what they want, right? And even on that question, how many of you had something on a roadmap and then sales came, but that's not what customers ask for. They ask for this, right? And you end up with faster horses syndrome, right? So let's have a look at how do we deal with that. So this is something that I took as my North Star. Amazon has been for a long time kind of a great influence on the way that I approach product development and product management. And this kind of specific statement by Jeff Bezos is something that always really resonated with me. Talking about Amazon, he says, we are not competitor-based, obsessed. We are customer-obsessed. We start with customer and we work backwards. The most important single thing is to focus obsessively on a customer. Now, that's great, right? And Amazon, I think, showed that throughout decades, remaining in the leadership position, in the leading position in the market by obsessively focusing on customers. So let's just say you want to do that. How do you measure, right? How do you measure that? How do you measure, are we being customer-centric? What does that really mean? How do you translate that in actions? How do you bake that into strategy for your portfolio? So you really want to separate your metrics into 2, right? You want to look at input metrics on one side, and you want to look on the output metrics on the other side. Now, output metrics is something that undoubtedly you are getting measured on all the time, right? How much did we sell? What's the ARR? What's the churn? What is the conversion? What's happening? All of those metrics, they're there, right? And then if there's something wrong with the numbers, okay, can you sell more? Can you increase ARR? What can you do about it, right? Well, if you're looking at a strategic approach, you really want to focus on input metrics. Input metrics we're defining as value that we would deliver to the customers, factors that we can actually control and change, right? Like how much control you have over how much you sell. Now you can go and say, well, yeah, I can increase the prices and I can, charge for the next release and I can do so much stuff. But if you are not adding more value to the customer, right, it's not going to last for long term, and ultimately you will face churn. So some input metrics that are going to very much vary across whether you're working on, let's say, B2C, whether you're working B2B. I predominantly worked in B2B for many years, and we are always looking at operational efficiency. Lots of our software is there to automate business processes, right? How do you measure that? What's the value that your customer gets? Operational efficiency, right? We work a lot with local government. Local government's got less and less money every single budget, right? So they need to do more with less. So how do we help them? We try to automate more and more processes so they can do more work, they can provide more service to the citizens by using less people. Similarly, when it comes to compliance, when it comes to accessibility, so many different things that will be required. So then effectively that North Star really for us becomes customer value. That's how we measure that, and that's how we go forward. So I'll move on to a real life example. So let's just say if this is your strategic portfolio, you're playing in a customer experience value chain, and you have a portfolio of products that are addressing various elements in that customer experience journey, from customer acquisition to sales enablement to onboarding and to support. And there is actually quite a few products out there, right, in the lobby that are addressing many of those points. So how do you now define those input metrics for each of those? What would they really mean, right? What would they really be, and what value would they deliver to the customers? So without reading through all of it, let's just pick up on customer acquisition, right? So things that really matter is the cost per lead, right? How much does it really cost me to get a lead? But then what is the conversion rate of lead to opportunity, right? Because if I get 100 leads at a cost of this, but a conversion rate is 5%, the other lead costs more, but a conversion rate is 50%, you do the maths, you end up with more value. And so on and so forth. So cost per opportunity, lead to opportunity time, and so on and so forth, right? So you would define those metrics across the portfolio, because you need to kind of understand, okay, so what is the value I'm giving to the customers? And let's take a look in my portfolio. What are the kind of critical elements? Where do I really want to focus? Where do I think that customers are currently leaking the most value? So in that portfolio, I'm going to specifically focus on the onboarding, which is one of the products that I took on. I kind of came into the company, looked at the overall value experience chain, and I was told, look, can you help us figure out how can we provide better value to our customers? Where do we start? We don't really have data. Everybody had an opinion, as you would expect, right? And I had to listen to all of their opinions, which was great fun. And then, so I ended up with customer onboarding and went to talk to the customers. And this is roughly what the customers told us. They said, look, we currently use manual customer onboarding. We use paper contracts and process. We have a manual data input, boarding time up to 30 days, and customer needs to get onboarded to 7 different back office systems, right? So our CTO came, look, Hannah, it's really obvious what you need to do, right? You need to automate the onboarding, 7 different systems. We need to get really clean APIs, integrations, get all of that sorted. I already created a backlog. You just need to deliver, all right? Brilliant, right? And then now let me bring that in context. Are any of our colleagues from Stripe here or the left? Okay, so this was in a world of payments. And when we said 7 different systems, we are talking about IBM mainframes, COBOL, right? Batch processing, SFTP transfers, and things like this. So now you create, right? So if you take a look at the bulk of this, you know, I was like, that's going to be a bit of a challenge. And mind you, I was in a company for 3 months, and you really want to make a mark, and there you go. So I was like, okay, I really need to come to the bottom of this. So let's start asking questions. So this is roughly how the conversation went. We currently use manual customer experience. Okay, what's the impact of that? Bad customer experience. You said that, but what is the impact of bad customer experience? Don't know. Okay. We're going to research that. Paper processing contracts, what's the impact of that? Well, we spend lots of time with customers, manual input for 3 to 5 contracts. So to put that in context, there was a salesperson who was going to a small shop, to small business, selling a point-of-sale device. They would sit down, they would open a bag, they would take a folder with literally 3 to 5 contracts, right? And there's a long story why that is, but that's just how it is. And now imagine trying to fill in 3 to 5 contracts where you need to put same information down, right? And you need to get it in a written form. So it's very painful. Okay, get it, customer experience, right? What is the impact? There is an attrition and bad NPS, and salespeople have less time to sell because they have to do so much paperwork. Okay, can you quantify that? Roughly, we spend 2 hours per customer. Okay, fair enough. What's the problem with manual data input? Okay, so operations FTE time, they roughly spend 3 hours per application. How much is that costing us? That's roughly annually for one of the clients. And our clients were big banks, typically nation-leading banks across EMEA, right? So you're talking to the likes of Lloyds and so on and so forth. So, so it cost for each of those clients for this manual processes serving, that was around £150,000. Okay, I've got something to work on. I started quantifying things. Boarding time is up to 30 days. Okay, not fun. What does that mean? When the merchant signs the contract, it takes 30 days for them to get point-of-sale device for them to be able to actually start trading. So that's a long time. But what's the impact of that? Well, there is a 30% attrition rate. Now, this is where they really caught my attention. That effectively means you worked really hard to convert your lead to opportunity to actually sign the contract. 30% of those are going to drop during that process. Now, that is a big money. So what's roughly impact of that? I'm not going to go into the numbers, but it was really big. It costed us roughly around 1 million per year per customer. So that's really significant. Okay, very good. A merchant needs to get onboarded to 7 different systems. What's the impact? Well, you have it above operational efficiency and all those things. Fine. Is there anything else? No, that covers it all. Okay, I'm going to go and walk the floors and research. Right? And that's one of the first lessons I learned: trust no one. Literally, trust no one, go there and talk to people. And very frequently, those of you who've done it, you will realize the truth is very different, when you start talking to the people on the floor rather than what I told you in the boardroom. Right? So there is a big disconnect from reality and high management in many organizations. So where do we go from here? So the first thing, typically, especially if you're in a world of business process automations, what roughly this sort of is you want to take a look at service assessment, design and redesign. What do we mean by that? If somebody's running things on manually, many different systems, all disjointed, you really don't want to automate that process. You want to sit down and say, hang on a second, what if, right? How would Google solve this problem, right? Like blue sky thinking, how can we do the best service design? Typically, you'll get an objection. We're just going to get moving. Why do we need to do this? In my experience, if you do service design properly, you're going to greatly simplify the business process, which means that a product development is going to take significantly less because you'll have less to do. Right? So it's a really worthwhile investment of time. And typically, since in my UX teams, I always had a service designer to go over that, and we've seen the benefits over years were huge. So, on very high level, what was the business process? So just you have a context for the conversation. So there was a data collection when the salespersons would walk in the shop. We would get a data for the contracts. Then that data would be put into big blue posting bag that was sitting on a floor where sales would come once a week. They would drop it in a big blue bag. Then somebody would take that big blue bag and take it to the operations floor, dump it on the operations floor, and then somebody had to take that and distribute to everybody else for them to key it in, right? And then it would go to compliance, it would go to risk compliance, AML, and they'll go and say this data is not matching. There's no company of that name, or company is wrong, or this email address is bouncing, or there's something wrong. Now, try getting a small merchant on the phone. Right there in a shop dealing with customers. Go back and see them. Imagine after they went through the nightmare of filling in 5 contracts, you go back and say, oh, sorry, we are 2 weeks late, because I don't have this information correct. It's very frustrating. So sometimes they would reject the merchant, even though perhaps data was wrong, right? Just think, what is the accuracy, failure, reading all these manually written contracts. I've seen raw data once, and it was scary. I couldn't sleep for 2 days. Okay, so from there you go to contract, you issue contract, digitalize that. So we actually, at the end, we would send them the final DocuSign contract. From there, that would go to onboarding team. So you literally have a floor full of people and type the same data, and that's lots of data, to 7 different systems. Right? From there, you go to activation. You activate the merchant, and then you go to shipment to fulfillment. You send that data to the fulfillment company, who would initiate a process and send out the device. So how did we approach this? How did I solve that problem and map it out? to understand where actually is the problem, what should we solve first, right? Remember, we were told automate the onboarding, that's really where the key is, don't worry about the rest. So I applied a method that I kind of picked up from service design and later on kind of evolved around, it's called value chain mapping. So effectively what you do, you map the entire value chain, so you've got your data collection, data input, risk and ML, contract boarding, fulfillment, right? So these are kind of high-level stages in the business process. So you define a process, you define which department. We were talking about silos earlier on, right? So these are your silos. In big organizations, these people will be sitting on different floors in different organizations. Very frequently, they're not going to talk to each other, right? So you kind of need to map all of that together. And then you kind of briefly describe the process, how that goes. Now, please don't judge my PowerPoint design skills. It gets worse than this. Then you want to capture outcome. What is the desired outcome from each of those processes? So rather than reading through, you get an idea, but let's focus on one. On data collection, you really want to collect all the data. You want to have accurate data, and you want to do that in a time-efficient manner, right? This is these are your outcomes. Then you start identifying friction points. What are those red, painful areas, right? Well, okay, 3 to 5 paper forms with largely repeated information, and there's loads of time wasting, right? And then you kind of carry on throughout, and you map that across, right? So now you start really quantifying where the problems are, what are exact problems down to the very granular level per persona. Now this is a very simplified value chain map. Nowadays, what we do in the pre-COVID era, we would have you would paint a big wall in your war room with a whiteboard paint and have a massive board there and paint all of this. Now we do all of that. COVID did some good, right? We kind of moved to this kind of tools, and this is much larger. Typically, on the friction points, I would also attribute that to various personas, right? So I would say these are the friction points for the customer, these are the friction points for the salesperson, and so on and so forth. So you know who is where. And probably the most important thing at this point, you want to go and identify your value metrics. What is it that really matter? What are those input metrics that we want to identify and that we want to track, right? So we want to be customer-centric. We want to be able to measure that customer centricity. Are we really customer-centric? Are we delivering value? And this is all about how do we define that value that we are delivering. So there is a mix of metrics that we kind of took across, right? Some of those metrics were FTE time per application, so we were adding cost because we roughly knew what was the salary, how much time they spent. You deduct, what that roughly cost you, so you can start doing your calculations later on. From there, once you came to this point, you have your solution design session. So you get all the relevant people in the room. You want to get your subject matter experts. You want to have your salesperson in. You want to have operations in. You want to have AML in. You want to have everybody in. You sit down and discuss how can we turn this better? How can we, what kind of solutions we can put in to solve that problem? And you map that across. And then you finally go and say, okay, let's hypothesize. If you're here today, and if we apply this, right, what's going to be the impact? How much less time you're going to spend? How much of attrition are we going to have? How much you're going to reduce the attrition for? And this is kind of where you put finger in the air and say, okay, we believe that this is the thing. Now, if you can get SMEs in a room, if you can get people who are actually doing this, your impact estimations are going to be way more accurate rather than just your PM with your product team who talk to customers but then don't do it. You're going to be slightly more off the chart there. So I can't stress the importance of having your customers on board, people who are actually doing that job. And then at the end, you get really valuable information because now you can add all of this up, right? And you can see, so what is really, this almost forms the first step in your business case, right? Because, look, now my attrition is costing me 900K. That's my biggest problem. Right? My FTE cost is 30% less, right? Now, if I take a look at here, if I'm writing these estimations, I'm going to bring that FTE cost down to 60K, and my attrition is going to be only 30K, right? So you go, so hang on a second, so where am I solving attrition? right? So you take a look, okay, so I'm solving attrition. You find where it is, you find how you're impacting that, and that automatically tells you where you really need to focus. Interesting thing that came out of this, that actually onboarding, that was the first part of the scope that was said, oh, this is the key thing you need to focus, wasn't contributing much to the solution at all. And I had a very big, a bossy CTO who was like, no, you need to do it this way. So I had to go back to the boardroom and actually challenge most senior stakeholders and say, I'm not going to do it your way, we're going to do it differently, right? Now, this is something where this kind of data becomes really powerful because there's no argument anymore, right? You have lots of opinions in the room, but you have data. And nobody's going to argue with you, no, you really need to invest here, where you're clearly showing that, no, the problem is somewhere else, and this is what I want to invest first. So for us, when we took this overall, we realized that actually we can solve 90% of our problems just by creating a really good data collection form where we are going to validate data upon input, right? So that means when they give you company house number, you link to company house APIs and you pull that data in. You're going to pull the data for every single director. That data is going to be accurate, right? You validate email address, you validate postcode, you validate all of this at the very input, which means that when that form is submitted to go to operations, to go to risk and compliance, your data is accurate. So you're cutting the time that's spent with a merchant and you're eliminating the biggest waste, the biggest loop. If you remember back in a business process where we were going back to merchants, and that was a big percentage of doing that. And something that's really important, all of this is hypothetical, right? And once you launch it, you actually really need to go out and you need to measure how it's performing, right? Now your CFO is going to go and say, hey, he's going to look at different metrics. You really want to focus and see, am I delivering that value to the customers? Did I really reduce attrition? Did I meet the target that I assumed I would meet, right? If I didn't, why I didn't, right? In this particular case, we took probably around 3 rounds of iterations until we got it right and we started hitting our metrics. And then after a year, we discovered something quite incredible. We thought we really nailed it here, but we actually completely overlooked a particular pot of value that absolutely dwarfed all of the benefits that we got here. What happened in the life of a salesperson, that salesperson was now spending significantly less amount of time with those merchants, and that salesperson used that time to go and knock the shops around. And the quality of the leads that they generated by going and talking to somebody in person was converting at a significantly higher rate than the leads that we were getting out of our marketing. So when they added up all of that together, our revenue went up for 50%. Right, so consider you have a 30% attrition, which was already a reduction in attrition, right? Why was that? Because we reduced boarding time to 2 days. It's very hard for somebody to drop out of the process within 2 days. So attrition went almost to nil, but we actually increased the revenue by 50%. And that was a beautiful little surprise that we didn't even know that was coming. And I'm not going to lie if I say that pretty much whenever I applied that later on, there was always something that we found out that was so impactful that we actually didn't consider at all, right? So again, we were talking at this table, we were talking about the importance of feedback, research, and all of this. I really can't stress enough how important is the investment in that. Actually, while we're kind of running through, I know there's a lot to absorb. If anybody's got a question as we're running through, please do a... Yes, please.
How long does that take you to relate that information?
So, very much depends. If you have all of your stakeholders ready to play, you can do this you can map all of this out in a couple of weeks, right? You walk the floors, you get the data, your solutioning workshop might take around a couple of days, you get everybody in, you can pretty much get this sorted out so you can then prioritize on the back of this very, very quickly. So what becomes for us, this really then becomes the heart of your product, right? It becomes the heart of your strategy. If anybody goes and says, hey, customer wants this, you just go, okay, so where's that on the value chain? What problem is that solving? a problem you don't have. Okay, great. Let's quantify that problem, right? How does it rank against everything else? When you prioritize, you know, well, I'm not going to prioritize boarding because this is going to be most expensive thing to automate, and it's bringing me the least value. And we actually never did it. What we realized when we went in, we realized, and it completely goes against the logic, I equally assumed that when you have one person typing in, right, data into 7 different systems, they're going to get things wrong. Their accuracy was incredible. So there was literally no problem, and we never ended up by automating that because it was like a no issue at all. It played no factor, right? So that becomes blueprint from your roadmap, and that becomes blueprint for your evolution of the product. And typically what I do nowadays, where we take this approach, we are trying to refresh that roadmap, that value chain map every 3 months. We are putting in new data. We are running our roadmap, refreshing our roadmap on a quarterly basis. And we review this, we take a look at new data, and we kind of adjust the course. We adjust the course accordingly. So where do you go from here? As I said, you go into defining and prioritizing your roadmap. So you're evaluating each part of the solution, cost versus value. Of course, you need to consider technical dependencies. So a particular aspect might not bring massive value in terms of what you're measuring, but it's a technical dependency for something else. So you might need to do that. You're looking at that customer experience, and then you go into your typical lean product stuff, right? You validate your solutions. You define your beta or MVP that you can get out with early adopters, and then you go into that build, measure, learn loop throughout the beta until you're confident that now you're really nailing it and you can really get it out. And interesting thing is, everybody in the entire product organization becomes really happy. You go to marketing, and marketing go, oh my God, I can build a really good story with this. Right? We frequently find that when we do this kind of research, we surface data that even our customers are not aware of. So when you do your product demo, right, so typical product demo is, look at how nicely this flows. I'm going to click on this button. I'm going to click on that button. I'm going to click here. With this kind of approach, you can tell a story, right? You tell persona-based story, and you say, hey, I'm a seller, and I'm a salesperson, and I struggle with this, right? And here I'm a merchant, and this is really painful. But our product does this, that adds this much value, and an average merchant saves this much time, and you can suddenly start pulling data. When you do a product demo in that particular way, you have real impact, right? Your salesperson after that literally just needs to go in and close the deal. And then to conclude with one of my favorite statements, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. So, thank you for your attention. Really happy to have a chat about what we discussed.
Questions going right here.
It's really interesting when you come up with the data. It makes a lot of sense. But I imagine there's a plucky young PM in each of these that have been saying exactly the same thing for like years and been hitting their head against the wall saying, look, I know what I'm doing, just let me do it. I'm just like, what's the difference between you coming in with a massive plan from the top down versus actually there's somebody who already knows what they're doing. Why don't I just give them the support and power to fix it?
Really good point. I would say, again, if you're working in a smaller team and you're not scaling, those conversations are much easier, right? You have a relationship, you know a person, and you can really do that. If you're really scaled, if you're at a CPO point, you've got a portfolio of dozens of products, you really need to have a scalable system, scalable methodology that is going to provide a consistent approach going across, right? Typically, when you walk into a product organization that struggle, the first and the most heard complaint from product managers is always like, somebody always overrides us, right? Somebody always knows better, right? We are the ones who talk to customers, and typically they struggle to win that argument because they don't have the right data to actually prove the points. So with the right data at your fingertips, those conversations become mute, Because you can have somebody go, but we should do this. And you say, but look, the data shows this. We spoke to 7 customers, did the analysis, walked the floor, collected the data. Data says this. Why would you want me to do that? And it becomes a very, very simple conversation.
But what was going wrong in the organization that meant you had to come in and do that? Like why, you've come in and done this analysis and showed that. Why couldn't the organization, what was stopping the organization doing that systemically in the first place?
I have an opinion on that.
Yeah, sure.
Let's just say most of, unfortunately, when I say most of, this is a very random statement, but let's just go with it.
Yeah.
Most of organizations are not product-led, right? If you take a look at a C-suite, if you take a look, that typically MDs came from sales, right? Or they came from kind of through finance. And they're looking at it in a very different way. I would say if you're in an organization that is product-led, where the CEO and the leadership came from, from product or from engineering or something, they're going to have a very different view on the world, and they'll be significantly easier to have conversation with and everything else. In the organizations where you kind of have a different leadership, where there is no product-led culture, those conversations are really, really hard and really difficult. That's at least my experience.
I think also when you started with talking about how CPOs are often looking after portfolios, and sometimes those are the outcome of mergers and acquisitions, right? But sometimes they are just silos. And so what he's done there is he's given a relative view across those. So a PM, unfortunately, unless they are, I think it was Charity was saying earlier, where she really tries to encourage her principal PMs to be T-shaped. Unless they're encouraged to be T-shaped and they're encouraged and facilitated to understand what other people are doing, how can you know that the onboarding flow is having this impact versus the data collection is having this impact? So I think what you've given is you've given a relative view across the side of the portfolio.
Exactly. And the great thing about this approach is that you could really apply this to macro and a micro level. Right? So I'm looking at my entire portfolio, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's literally providing solutions across the care continuum value chain with the main mission trying to keep everybody as long as far to the left, right? And we grew our portfolio, VRP portfolio, we grew it through mergers and acquisitions. There's very little that we actually build ourselves. And I came into the vision that literally products don't talk to each other. Products worked into silos. They were all recently acquired. It's very typical. And now, the only way you can really put a strategy together, break those silos, really understand those flows, really understand those personas, really understands where the value is for them, to start mapping that out, to understand where do I start, right? How do I move on? How do I, where can we add the biggest impact?
Just what I worry about is if you were hit by a car, the organization would go back to doing exactly that. How do you create or how do you delegate that to either your director?
Okay. So I'd say there are 2 ways. You need to do that going upwards and going down, right? So again, at this table, we were talking about the importance of creating a culture, right? Customer-centric culture. So the big challenge is everybody, typically if you come in the organization, it's not product-led, the culture at the top is all going to be output metrics, output metrics, output metrics, right? It's down to you in that time to actually using data, using logic to explain, look, this is why this is really important, and this is the impact it has, and this is how it pays off over a larger period of time. Then you have your investors on the top of that, right? Who might not even not know your business, who are just looking at their investment ROI, right? So kind of, it's really, really important that you tackle that at the same time as you're empowering your organization, right? So what I'm doing at the moment is working with my product directors and everybody else in the product team for them to understand, look, this is how I would like to go forward, and this is why it works. What do you think? And I didn't come across a person who goes, oh, it's just a pile of rubbish, I want to do something else. The commonly asked questions, I think, was, to believe you are, no, somebody else here, how long does this take? Right, because it does look, whoa, kind of lots of effort goes into this. It depends, but something like this, for a portfolio of products, I delivered with senior BA and a PM working for a couple of weeks. Right? So it really doesn't have to be lots of effort if you're really on a roll, if you have competent people, and it pays off massively. 2 weeks is nothing if you can get right stakeholders in the room.
I think we have room for one more question, and then we should go into the next panel in that. Any other questions? No? Okay, this was amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.